Prisoner of war. On November 6, 1944, we arrived on the east coast of the United States and entered New York Harbor. That same day, the Western Allied troops in the Netherlands were east of the city of Nijmegen, and with Aachen, the first major German city, had been captured. However, further east, in the enormous forests west of the Ruhr River, the most intense fighting occurred on November 6th. The battle for the Hürtgen Forest would become the largest land battle for American forces on German soil. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was preparing for the assault on Warsaw and Budapest in early November. However, we knew nothing of all this fighting on the European front. We all stood on the ship's railing, contemplating the Statue of Liberty and the Manhattan skyline. The former, which seemed gigantic to us, made an especially deep impression. When some American sailors noticed our astonishment, they laughed and commented that there would not be much freedom for us prisoners of war in the near future. We had to recognize with contrition that they were indeed right. Now we had to hand over everything we had saved from the supply and food boxes during the trip. All that remained were our uniforms, a duffel bag with a blanket and extra clothes, and the personal items we carried. The ship docked at a pier, and we disembarked via the gangway. Upon leaving, we were greeted by a crowd of curious American citizens. With great interest, they watched as we lined up and counted off. Suddenly, a man from the crowd shouted to us in German, "How are the Panteras? How are the Tigres?" We had to smile, but we remained silent and greeted him with a friendly wave. They took us to a large hall where we had to take off our clothes to shower. Then a doctor examined us, and we were given new clothes. Black pants, light-colored shirt, and the old uniforms went in the duffel bag. After that, we were registered again and divided into new groups. The officers were also reorganized, but this time they separated us immediately. Our group of about 15 men and the clique of 5 renegade officers. From that moment on, each of the different groups of prisoners of war would be transferred separately. Our group of officers, along with some guards, marched through the center of bustling New York to a public subway station. Everything was new to us, and, with great astonishment, we observed our surroundings, which were unusual and, above all, colorful. The inhabitants of New York noticed our presence more or less casually, occupied with their daily tasks and passing hastily by us. At the station, we boarded a subway that took us to the other side of the Hudson River. I would never have imagined that one day I would travel on the New York City subway. We continued moving under Manhattan until we reached a train station from where trains departed westward. There they put us on large Pullman cars and sent us west. What followed was a train journey of several days and almost 2,500 kilometers. Inside the train, the guards informed us that our destination was Alva, Oklahoma. If the United States had a central point, it would be around there. The city of Alva was located about 145 kilometers northwest of Oklahoma City, the state's capital. And they told us something else, that we would be staying in a Nazi camp. I was bewildered. Are they going to send us to a Nazi camp? I thought, exasperated. In my country, and especially at the front, I had never worried about politics. Nowadays, this could be grounds for an accusation against me. However, back then I considered myself first a soldier and then an officer, and as such I had the duty to serve our people. With that, any question about politics was answered from my point of view. I was responsible for the lives of all the soldiers under my command, and, therefore, I was obliged to ensure their survival. After each casualty we suffered, I racked my brains, thinking about how it could have been avoided. The result was that I often came to the depressing conclusion that pure luck decided between life and death. When Lieutenant Bratz and I wrote letters to the loved ones of a fallen soldier, we always tried to describe his death without pathos. But we also avoided asking questions about the meaning of death. Our sense of duty did not even allow us to ask those questions. That was the world that we lived in. But it would never have occurred to me to call ourselves Nazis for that. On the contrary, even in the Hitler Youth, I felt a deep rejection for those party barons who strutted like roosters with their brown uniforms. Apparently, our restless behavior during the interrogation days in St. Louis, and also the animosities with our own renegade officers, had earned us this destiny in Alva. Once again, I felt bitterness. How is it possible that just for invoking the rules of the Geneva Convention, someone was immediately branded a fanatic? Did being captive justify renouncing all sense of honor? This was absolutely repugnant to me. I preferred to remain faithful to my principles, as I had been taught. Throwing the towel now that I was in the hands of the victor seemed to me vile, as if I were betraying my loved ones at home. To whoever listened to them, these words might seem stubborn, but many others share my feelings. And in the long conversations we had on the ship or on the train, we only found that our convictions were reinforced. The war had not yet ended, and at least most of us still did not have the slightest idea of the inhuman atrocities committed in the name of Hitler. Therefore, we were proud to be German officers who, despite capture, had not been stripped of our pride and dignity. What will people think of us at home? We constantly asked ourselves. During the long train journey to Oklahoma, we had much time to think. The American landscape, unusually flat, passed before our eyes, and every time we stopped at a station, we discovered new things, such as huge spherical water towers that generated the pressure necessary for the water to run through the pipes in those flat regions. Our train was not identified, so during the brief stops, the American girls waved to us, undoubtedly thinking that we were American soldiers. We happily returned the greeting. At the train station of a city called Emporia, we even had the opportunity to chat with an American girl who spoke perfect German. Our military police guards were deliberately lax and did not intervene. At night, we often passed through cities that were lit as if it were daytime. It was a very unusual image for us, since in our country we had to keep everything dark to avoid air raids. Here, however, work in the factories could continue day and night. For us, the United States seemed truly huge. Hitler had not traveled much. That became clear to me as I crossed the vast expanses of American land. On November 9th, at 2 a.m., we arrived in Alva. In the early morning, they took us to the camp. It seemed to us a small city illuminated by electric lamps as bright as day. We were assigned some barracks. Heffel, who had been by my side since my capture, moved into a room with me. It had 2 beds, 2 closets, a table, and 2 chairs. After a short night, we went to breakfast at 7 a.m., which was served in a huge dining room. To my great surprise, there was a lectern at one end of the room, decorated with a swastika flag. Behind it hung an imperial eagle with a wingspan of almost 2 meters. The food was already served on the long tables. We sat down and immediately began talking. Then we were asked to pay attention, and I could not believe what I heard. They read aloud a speech by the Führer. I began to understand why the Americans called this camp the Nazi camp. Later I learned that the American soldiers also called it Devil's Island. Back in our barrack, I spoke to Heffel about what had happened. Like me, he was not a member of the NSDAP, nor did he feel much sympathy for our Supreme Party barons. In his opinion, his duty as a German officer obliged him to his people, not the party. We decided to keep a low profile and keep waiting. Thus, we discovered that many of the prisoners there, like us, had insisted on being treated correctly and in accordance with the Geneva Convention during capture and interrogation. However, there was also a core of irreversibly convinced National Socialists who were very eager to let us know which Supreme Commander we still served. For most of us, however, all this was already completely irrelevant. We had accepted life in this American camp, hoping to return as soon as possible to our loved ones. We decided for ourselves that we did not want to have anything to do with politics or with the formation of groups. And we remained faithful to that decision. On my arrival day, there were around 1,500 German officers of different ranks in the field. Many had been captured in 1943 after the capitulation in Africa or later during the fighting in Italy. The prisoners were organized into companies of about 200 men each. About 50 men were housed in each barrack. The higher the rank, the more space was assigned to each prisoner. In addition to the barracks, there was a dining room with a kitchen, bathrooms, an infirmary, the commander's office, and several smaller barracks and warehouses. The field occupied an area of approximately 550 by 550 yards and was surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. To quickly detect possible fugitives, they counted us every morning and night. In fact, there had already been several escape attempts, but all failed within a few days. It was no surprise to us. After all, where could a fugitive go from a camp in the heart of the United States? The prospect was simply too desperate to really plan an escape. The climate in the heart of the United States was similar to the drought conditions I had already faced in the North African desert. From time to time, there were even sandstorms in or near the camp. However, unlike Africa, we could now take refuge in our barracks, which were well built enough that hardly any dust entered. So, we sat in our barracks and watched the storm through the windows. Most of the time, we wore our old uniforms, and especially those that we had left from Africa were useful on days like those. We were also allowed to wear rank insignia and even medals. I found a considerable number of Iron Cross bearers among the inmates. Still as proud as before, I got another Iron Cross First Class to replace the one the French soldier had torn from my jacket during my capture. Some prisoners had built a shortwave radio transmitter, so the press releases from the Wehrmacht were regularly read to them. The Americans obviously had no objection to this, since by then it was no secret that the German armies were retreating on all fronts. However, those truly loyal to the Nazi regime found this very difficult to accept and tried to revive our faith in the people, the Reich, and the Führer with their best efforts of persuasion and stirring rhetoric. Even so, most of us realized that we had lost the war. This admission, as well as the awareness of the disaster we had caused in the world, weighed more and more on our conscience. We tried not to be alone and talked about everything for hours. If you were alone, you immersed yourself in your thoughts, which inevitably ended up worrying about your loved ones at home. There was also the possibility of sending postcards through the Red Cross. Many of us were delighted to do so, and I, of course, was one of them, although we never received a response from home. We couldn't know if our letters reached their destination. But hope is the last thing to be lost, so we all kept writing enthusiastically. From the day the first German prisoners of war arrived at the Alva camp in the summer of 1943, things had changed considerably. By then, the camp had its own academy, which included a library and reading room. Many of the captured German officers had worked at universities in their private lives and now also taught classes in the field. I decided to take advantage of the time and started studying mechanical engineering. Thanks to this, the following weeks passed quickly for me, as they were full of study, sports, games of scat, and hours of conversations about everything that had been and was to be. Naturally, these conversations also included the evolution of the war. At the end of December 1944, we learned of the German offensive in the Ardennes, whose objective was to push back the Western Allies once more. For a few days, many of us thought that the Wehrmacht might advance again, but it soon became clear that this offensive by 3 German armies had not achieved a decisive breakthrough. Meanwhile, the number of German prisoners of war arriving in the United States continued to increase. Although every day was the same, we did everything possible not to lose track of the week. To this end, shows by groups of prisoner artists were often organized on Saturday nights. Some of the artists were very talented, and there were many musicians. Since I was a good yodeler and had met a lieutenant from Holland, Tyrol, named Franz Posch, who also knew how to yodel, the two of us became the stars of some nights. Christmas 1944 was celebrated in the same way, which helped a lot to alleviate homesickness. But, despite everything, at some point you always ended up alone with your thoughts. I still had no idea if my loved ones had received any sign of life from me. That uncertainty could drive you crazy. At the end of February 1945, a new rumor spread. All the officers were going to be transferred to another camp. And, indeed, on March 1st, we boarded a train that passed through Arkansas City in the direction of Dermot. The city of Dermot was in Arkansas, near Oklahoma, the neighboring state, not far from the Mississippi River. Here I was going to spend the 7 months of prison I had left. The climate in Dermot was completely different from Alva's. We noticed that as soon as we got off the train. Here, in Mississippi, the weather was quite humid and muggy. The field in Dermot was considerably larger than that of Alva. It had originally been built as the Jerome Relocation Center, an internment camp for Japanese and American citizens of Japanese descent. Its maximum capacity was almost 10,000 men. On the day of my arrival, there must have been about 7,000 German prisoners, housed in approximately 40 blocks. The Americans used Dermot to exclusively house the officers. Heffel and I moved again to a shared room in one of the barracks. As this time, it was a room with 3 beds. They reinforced us with Lieutenant Ernst Hahn. He was a veteran of the Russian campaign and had been wounded 5 times, the last time in Normandy, where he was captured. The 3 of us got along well from the beginning and remained together until the end of our captivity, experiencing all kinds of vicissitudes. Dermot had all kinds of facilities, including a field academy like the one at Alva. This allowed me to continue my engineering studies and have busy days again. I studied and played sports, especially handball. Once again, there were shows by various artistic groups. Under the direction of Lieutenant Kurt Woes, an Austrian conductor who would later become famous, a respectable field orchestra had formed, offering concerts regularly. In addition, there were even film screenings. As before in Alva, each month we received $21 coupons that we could use to buy things in the field cafeteria. There was writing paper, pencils, books, fruit, cigarettes, and even jewelry. Cigarettes were an especially valuable barter good for this and that. I managed to save some of these $1 coupons, and later in Austria, I was able to exchange them for Austrian currency at 10 shillings per dollar. As before in Alva, there were officers among our ranks who were still convinced that the German Reich would be victorious, even though everyone was already at war against them. They spoke of Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons that would change the course of the war. At the end of March 1945, however, the Western Allies had already crossed the Rhine and were facing Frankfurt in Western Germany. And in the east, the Red Army was on the Oder River, facing Berlin, and on March 28, 1945, it crossed the border between Hungary and Austria. The Thousand-Year Reich, that Nazi Germany had proclaimed itself, was in its last days. I remained true to my resolution and stayed out of any political conversation. After all, it was quite difficult to explain to an officer captured in Africa in 1943 what massive troops the Allies had landed in Normandy in 1944. Every time I recounted my encounters with the overwhelming enemy in Normandy, my accounts were usually dismissed as exaggerated. At some point, I stopped trying. Only those who had also fought in Normandy knew better. Attempts to form our own Austrian group failed miserably. However, the differences of opinion and personal experiences among my compatriots were too great. The 3 of us decided to stay out of everything, and so I continued living under a shared roof with a man from Saxony and one from Baden-Württemberg. We had entered this war together, and now we also had to get to the end together. What had to happen did happen. We learned that Adolf Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th, and finally, on May 9th, 1945, we received the news of the German capitulation. Although we expected it, hearing the news left us breathless. Now it was definitive. We had lost the Second World War. It is difficult to describe in words what we felt at that moment. We realized with horror that we had sacrificed the best years of our lives in vain, that our home was in ruins. In fact, that in our name, almost all of Europe had been severely affected. I felt infinitesimally small. The burdens of the future that lay ahead seemed impossible to bear. Then came the atomic bombings and the Japanese capitulation. With that, the Second World War came to an end. However, what did not end that day was the suffering of all the peoples who had fought in it. Many human lives would still be lost in the painful immediate aftermath of the war. Many would take years to find a new home, and many would never be able to return to a peaceful life. We were in the middle of summer, with sweltering heat, and another unpleasant circumstance presented itself to us. The treatment that the Americans gave us worsened quickly. We could not avoid thinking that, until then, they had only treated us well, because they feared for their own soldiers captured in Germany. Now there was no longer any need, and they made us feel it. The food worsened noticeably. I began to have kidney problems. When I could no longer bear the pain and went to the infirmary, I was diagnosed with kidney stones. It would take me quite a while to eliminate them. However, the The kidney problems would accompany me for years, an indelible memory of the dry times with little hydration in Africa. At the end of August 1945, a new rumor suddenly arose. They were going to put us to work outside the camp. That was something completely new. According to the Geneva Convention, it was forbidden to force captured officers to work, a right that we had always invoked until that moment. Well, as it spread through the camp, discomfort quickly arose. The military order and discipline that we prisoners had maintained until the end of the war had almost completely disappeared. Faith in the possibility of victory had been the basis of a certain solidarity among many. After the German capitulation, that hope had vanished forever, and many were now fighting within their own interest groups, while others were completely alone. The Americans were smart to hide our future destiny as forced laborers. To those who were willing to work, they promised to return home shortly. Two large factions formed among the prisoner officers. On the one hand, there were those who wanted to work to return home as soon as possible. On the other, those who insisted on their rights and did not feel obliged to work. The tension between the two groups became unbearable. Finally, the Americans handed out forms for us to register for work. The emotional stress was extreme. As a prisoner of war, you were at the mercy of the enemy. You could only make decisions based on vague assumptions, but never on real certainties. August Heffel, Ernst Hahn and I consulted and decided that we would not sign. Once the decision was made, we felt somewhat relieved since we could observe with some distance the discussions and, often, even the physical fights between the other officers. Many claimed not to have signed the form, but in reality they did so in secret, hoping to return home sooner. Once the Americans finished with these procedures, the following measure was taken. Now we were repeatedly ordered to participate in film screenings. The images that they forced us to see were truly incredible. Recordings made by the American troops during the liberation of the German concentration camps. The images we saw were so horrifying that we could not believe they were real. In fact, we did not want to believe it, because if those atrocities were real, then the guilt that we had committed would be of a magnitude almost impossible to bear. We tried to convince each other that it was mere propaganda, but deep down we were beginning to realize that behind our front lines, in our homeland and in the occupied territories, something so inhuman had happened that no word could ever describe it. During lunch, we sat in silence, and due to the heat, sweating over our watery soup, we racked our brains thinking about what they had shown us. Again and again, I tried to remember if I had heard the term concentration camp before. Again and again, I had to answer no. All this exhausted me, and in the following weeks, I lost more than 5 kilos of weight. I repressed what I had seen, immersing myself in my books and studying like a madman. I returned to my childhood dream of becoming an engineer, a profession that would be very necessary in the future. It seemed to me a sensible goal to fight for. But the images I had seen, the sounds I had heard, imposed themselves again and again on my mind. For more than 5 years, as a young German officer, I had fought for a better life and for a respected and idealistic Germany. Now, however, I painfully realized that I was being held responsible for the political atrocities that had been committed in the distant past. September 1945 passed, and October 1st was approaching. That day, the Americans wanted to separate those who were willing to work from those who were not. This was done more secretly. Those who were willing to work had been ordered to leave the camp of the Americans the day before, and now, in the early hours of the morning, they began to escape. Many of them had become good friends of ours during the last months, and now they were leaving without saying goodbye. At first, Heffel, Hahn, and I did not realize. Then we realized that, suddenly, we were almost alone in the camp. At noon, the American guards gathered the remaining prisoners. There were about 1,200 officers left. All the other prisoners of war had been moved from the camp for good. For me, it was another day of disillusionment, showing that even the best camaraderie and closest friendship had its limits. That said, I understood that many men simply wanted nothing more than to go home. The remaining officers concentrated in their area in the center of the camp. The 3 of us moved to new barracks. During the following days, we were anxious to know what would happen. However, to our surprise, nothing happened. The Americans even began to treat us more kindly than before, and the food improved significantly. None of us had a real explanation, but we were all visibly relieved that things had gone well. Peace and order, as well as a regulated daily routine, returned to the camp, and the Americans even refrained from showing us movies. Interestingly, most of those who had been especially faithful to the Nazi Party were also the ones who signed the form in secret. Now they were gone, and we didn't miss them. At the end of December 1945, that is, only 2 months later, we learned that we were going to be taken back to Europe in January 1946. We were delighted. It was fantastic news. We spent Christmas of 1945 very animated. On January 20th, 1946, we were put on train cars, and after a trip of several days, we were transferred to the Camp Shanks in Orangeburg, north of the city of New York. Until the last moment, we were still having doubts, but when the train began to move, we knew that we were really going home. At each stop along the way, we greeted the American civilians, who were radiant with joy. Such was our euphoria. In New York, we got back on American Liberty's ship that would take us home. In the conversations we had just before boarding, we heard that many German officers who were now doing forced labor had not yet been told when they would return home. We couldn't know if it was true, as it seemed hard to believe. Apparently, the Americans couldn't do anything with us who were unwilling to work. All we did was cost them money and labor. Would it have been worth it to have remained true to our principles? In any case, the important thing was that we were going home. We boarded with an almost exuberant mood. There the rules were explained to us again by an officer of the American Navy, but this time also present was an officer of the German Navy. The latter would also act as spokesman for all prisoners of war. He was Austrian and, as I learned later, originally from Carinthia. The Atlantic crossing lasted 10 days, and our destination was the port of Le Havre on the French coast of the English Channel. We were allowed to move freely around the ship, and the food was good. During the trip, we were interrogated by American officers. We had to say where we wanted to go in our countries. This had to do with the fact that Germany and Austria had been divided into different occupation zones, with the Soviets controlling one in each country. I already knew this, so I said that my address was in Admont, Styria, which was further west of my hometown, outside the Soviet zone. When it was pointed out to me that Pot Shack was listed as my hometown in the registry, I claimed that my parents had fled the Russian advance to Styria. This was accepted with some surprise, but the new address was registered without ado. I was told that I would be transferred from France to Germany through several transit camps, until I was finally released in a special release camp. At least that was the intention of our American guards then. Shortly before arriving in Le Havre, we were gathered together once more. An American officer announced that, after our arrival, we would be handed over to the French, who would take us to a first transit camp, and from there, we could finally travel home. Finally, he made us understand that the French did not hold us in high esteem and warned us officers that we could be subjected to harsh treatment. He advised us to remove any insignia of rank and medals from our uniforms. As soon as we were in French hands, no responsibility would be assumed for the treatment we received as prisoners. In addition, the American officer mentioned that we should hide our personal belongings as best we could, since we would undoubtedly be searched. An audible groan ran through the crowd. This announcement greatly discouraged us. However, since we had arrived all that way, we decided to keep our heads up and stay together as long as possible. We felt stronger as a group. At the port, they made us disembark and put us immediately on American trucks. In the first minutes on European soil, they showed us already that we were not welcome there. The French port workers looked at us with hostility and insulted us as they walked by. The trucks took us to a field near the city of Bolbec, about 25 kilometers to Le Havre's east. For me, the name of Bolbec meant nothing then, but years later, I learned that many German soldiers had died there due to the inhumane treatment of the French. In a completely open terrain and without any sustenance, thousands of people had found a miserable death after their capture. Once in Bolbec, we felt immediately transported back to our capture. We were greeted by emaciated and exhausted German prisoners who looked at us with weary eyes. All this almost a year after war's end. We got off the trucks and were greeted by French soldiers, who first made us form lines of 1,200 men. Next, there was a long discussion between our spokesman, the Corinthian naval officer, and one of the French officers. Our spokesman managed to negotiate that we would be housed together in a part of the camp. Once there, we realized that the times of good treatment had certainly ended. We only found barracks with the interior covered in straw and nothing more. That's how we spent our first night there, which was extremely cold at that time of year. The next day, our spokesman demanded to be able to speak with an officer, which was granted to him. A small delegation of French officers and a civilian who worked for the Red Cross appeared to listen to our concerns. Our man requested better accommodation, as well as treatment according to the Geneva Convention. He also gave a letter to the Red Cross worker. The French listened to everything without a word and then left. After another freezing night, they returned the following day. This time, they were accompanied by a representative of the Red Cross from Frankfurt, who listened to the objections of our spokesman and promised to pass them on. But things turned out differently. Nothing happened for days, but after about 2 weeks, a large contingent of French soldiers arrived, divided us into small groups, and put us on separate trucks, which headed to different parts of the camp. August Heffel, Ernst Hahn, and I knew that we would now be separated, so it was time to say goodbye to my loyal friends. We quickly exchanged addresses and promised to get in touch as soon as we could. We each wished each other the best, and, above all, good luck in finding our loved ones. Finally, they separated us and took us away. After about 14 days, I was put back on a truck as part of a new group and transferred to another camp. Upon our arrival, we had to endure the initial registration. I had prepared for it and was able to keep all my personal belongings, including a necklace with a small gold cross that I had bought for Helena at the Dermot cafeteria. We spent several more days in this camp before embarking on a several-week odyssey that would take us to 2 other French prisoner camps, whose names and locations remained unknown. Every time we arrived, we were registered. To our resentment, German prisoners were employed to do this, who had apparently pleased their French captors and now performed this ignoble work for them. The food and accommodation in these French camps were always bad, but there was something that still gave us hope. Little by little, but steadily, we were being moved further east. However, it was also a time of unease, as prisoners were selected and relocated again. We never knew where they were going. There were many rumors, and we often heard that many were destined for forced labor. There were destroyed French cities to rebuild, and having German prisoners of war to work for you seemed convenient. Many of those who had arrived in France full of hope from America disappeared into French labor camps for months or even years, and were even forced to clear minefields. In these camps or minefields, your life was worth very little. Many suffered irreversible damage to their health, and quite a few lost their lives. Then, after several weeks, they separated the Germans from the Austrians. At first, I was alone for a few days, but I befriended Lieutenant Heimo Skobrel. He had been Fallschirmjäger, a paratrooper officer, and was originally from Leoben in the Austrian region of Styria. When he learned of my dilemma, that my loved ones were in the Soviet occupation zone, and that I had declared Admont in Styria as my home, he offered his help. He gave me his parents' address, who lived in Leoben, and promised me that I could find refuge there after my possible dismissal. I accepted his offer gratefully. At the end of March 1946, I boarded a train in eastern France with a large group of Austrians, and we left for Germany. Heimo Skobrel had not come, but I remembered his offer faithfully. In Karlsruhe, we crossed the Franco-German border and quickly continued towards Stuttgart and Munich until we reached Salzburg in Austria. The landscape stretching before us was desolate. We crossed devastated cities. Their train stations were little more than piles of rubble, and their inhabitants lived in bombed ruins. We felt devastated by the sheer magnitude of the destruction caused by the Allied bombings. How long would rebuilding everything take? We were very discouraged, but even so, when we crossed the border between Germany and Austria in Salzburg, we knew that we had made it, that we had returned home. We hugged each other, radiant with joy, and many men had tears in their eyes. We had returned home. The return home. When I stepped on Austrian soil after long years of combat and captivity, I returned to a home that was destroyed and occupied. I knew absolutely nothing about my family. All I could do was hope that they had stayed in our native region, which was not a Soviet occupation zone, and that they had survived unscathed. However, visiting the Russian zone was unthinkable. Many advised me against it, since there was a real danger that the Soviets would stop you and send you to Siberia. My friend Ernst Hahn would suffer that fate. He returned to East Germany, was arrested by the Soviets right on the demarcation line, and spent 2 years of hard labor in a Soviet prison camp. He never fully recovered from that time. The train took us from Salzburg to Villach, where we entered a British liberation camp. There we were already allowed to move with some freedom. However, I needed a certificate of liberation, for which I had to present a home address. Therefore, I requested permission to go to Leoben to visit my family. It was granted to me as a prisoner of war. So I fulfilled the promise I had made to Heimo Skobrel and presented myself at his parents' door. They were very happy to receive news of their son through me and pledged to help me. Mr. Skobrel got me a job in a workshop, and together we went to the local authorities to apply for a residence permit. They also granted it to me immediately. The first thing I did was to send 2 telegrams, one to my beloved Helena and another to my parents. They had to know that I had returned. Thus, provided with the necessary documents, I took the train back to Villach. Back in the liberation camp, I presented them, and they gave me a certificate of liberation without more complications. At the beginning of April 1946, I left the British camp as a free civilian. Without hesitation, I boarded a train and returned to Leoben, where I settled in a room at the Skobrel family's house. A couple of days later, I managed to contact my parents by phone. My telegram had not reached them, but Helena had received hers and had already announced my return, overflowing with joy. This had been, in fact, the first message they had received from me. I had been missing since October 1944, a year and a half ago. None of the numerous postcards and letters that I had sent through the Red Cross had reached their destination. During the following weeks, I made plans for my first trip home. It was not so simple, since I had to cross from the British occupation zone to the Soviet zone. Finally, the British gave me a permit to leave their zone. It was a pass limited to 3 days. With that in hand, I put my plan into action. I got on a train and headed to Potshak. At the Semmering Pass, where the border between the zones was, there was a brief moment of fear when the Soviet soldiers checked my documents. But, fortunately, after carefully examining the pass, they let me pass. For me, it was a delicate situation, since it was the first time I had contact with Soviet soldiers. I had not seen a single one during the war. When I arrived in Potshak in mid-April 1946, the first thing I did at the train stop was hug my beloved Helena. The first thing we did was go to my parents' house. The journey from the train stop only lasted about 15 minutes. Everything was the same as before. When I entered through the main door, my parents were waiting for me. Moments later, we were already embracing. The next step was going to the town hall, where I intended to register. Once there, I realized that things had changed in Potshak after all. Although those who had joined a Nazi party in the past did not greet me, many of those who had clamored for annexation of Germany in 1938 apparently also lived well after the war's end. I came to the sad conclusion that people always manage to end up on the winning side. Many former Austrian communists have been reinstated by the Soviets in communities and police stations, where the old regime would have persecuted them. Now, they were favorites of our Soviet occupiers. This would have consequences for me. Upon arriving at the police station, they gave me a document confirming my release from captivity. It also stated that I had been Oberkammerschaftsführer, first-class leader of the Hitler Youth, which also made me a former candidate for the Nazi Party. The passage from the Hitler Youth to party candidate had occurred automatically. At that time, in 1940, there was no reason for me to oppose it. However, in the following years, there had been no relationship between me and the party or its politics. The only mentions about it between my colleagues and me had been when we cursed the party barons up above. I acknowledged the documentation and was told that I also had to report for compulsory work the next day. I presented my British pass and declared that I was going to return to their occupation zone. In addition, I let them know that I had not been forced to work during my imprisonment and that it would continue to be so. This principle would also apply to the new rulers of Pot Shack. The policeman took note without any comment. My trip to Pot Shack had been brief, but it helped clear up the uncertainty that had overshadowed Helena's and my future. Despite the completely unpredictable conditions, I asked her to marry me, and she accepted with joy. We agreed that my next birthday, July 20th, 1946, would be our wedding date. That would also be the occasion of my next visit to Pot Shack. Although there was hardly anything edible, my parents and my parents-in-law had done everything possible to make us comfortable. To this day, I'm very grateful to them, and I can say without exaggeration that it was the best day of my life. I was overflowing with joy at having arrived home, and the fact that my brother Otto had also returned in good health was a great joy for us all. He had come out unscathed, and my loved ones had also survived the chaos of war without suffering damage. Thus, we had something that millions and millions of human beings had not been able to have. I perceived this fact with conscious humility and deep modesty. So many people in Europe had died, had suffered permanent injuries, had lost their loved ones because of senseless violence or cold-blooded murder, had been subjected to immeasurable suffering, had been displaced and left homeless, not even knowing what the next day would bring. My 2 visits to Pot Shack had been brief, and in the end it would take a long time before I could return permanently. The following months were marked by difficulties and hard setbacks. I spent the following year in Vienna, where an acquaintance had helped me get a job. My participation in the Hitler Youth and the fact that I had been an officer would haunt me for a long time. The first setback I suffered at the Technological University of Vienna, where I intended to finish my mechanical engineering degree. However, I first had to appear before a committee that decided whether I was implicated for my past relations with the Nazi Party, so that I would not be allowed to enroll. When I arrived and presented my documents, I was told that I had been a candidate for the party due to my leadership position within the Hitler Youth, and that, as a consequence, my enrollment could not be tolerated. And even less so, because I had also been an officer of the Wehrmacht. They asked me kindly, but firmly, to leave. I felt so humiliated that I was speechless. At that moment, I felt how the resentment that had arisen for the first time during my captivity in the United States resurfaced when we were shown the terrible images of the concentration camps. And although we thought they were mere propaganda, they had caused a deep change within us, a persistent doubt that had finally become resentment. It would take me months to clear my stigma, and, against all odds, I would finally be allowed to work as the engineer I had aspired to be. Little by little, I would also discover more things about the final months of the war. At the end of 1944, the 21st Panzer Division was withdrawn from the Western Front to recover in the rear, from where it was deployed to the Eastern Front at the beginning of 1945. There it fought against the advance of the Red Army forces until the end of the war in the Halby Pocket, where tens of thousands of German and Russian soldiers would meet their death. The few survivors of the 21st Panzer Division were taken as prisoners of war by the Russians. Some would not return until years later. Many others never would. Hans von Luck, commander of our neighboring regiment, would not return until 5 years after his imprisonment. In that time, he had witnessed many horrors, but he had also learned to understand the Russian people. It had been a really difficult time for him, as he narrowly escaped death on more than one occasion and had his gold teeth violently torn out. But there were not only stories about the military resolution of the war and the fate of the men who had fought it, or the formations that had carried it out. Things got even worse. I found out that in the last year of the war, there was more destruction and even greater loss of lives than in previous years. In retrospect, now I could build a crazy case against the crimes committed by our German side. I could compare them with the atrocities that Allied troops committed. But that would not make sense. It would be a means without end. I can only come to the conclusion that this catastrophe of the 20th century had its roots in the year 1919, with the inhuman peace treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain. That fateful day was the cause of the resentment that fermented throughout the 20s and 30s until reaching inhuman and degrading excesses that escape all description. Without the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain, there would have been much less impoverishment in Germany and Austria. There would not have been the communist threat, and Therefore, perhaps Adolf Hitler would not have emerged as a response to the imperialist and exploitative policy of the victors of the Great War. With a just and honorable peace that facilitated international understanding after the First World War, there would have been no Second World War. Some of those in power realized this as early as 1919, but their voices went unheard. Thus, the vicious cycle continued. As for me, my whole vision of the world collapsed at the end of the Second World War. I started a new life and tried to live it as well as I could. And after years of resentment, I began to deal again with the war era. I visited the places where I had fought. I walked through the eucalyptus forest of Jeddah, along the road to the Pegasus Bridge in Benouville, through the fields and meadows of Falaise. Each time, I was overcome by gratitude for having survived and having found the strength to get out of the confusion, to become a refined person and start again. However, many others who did not survive, who never had the opportunity to think about all this, who in fact could not have acted otherwise, are still there today. All of them, whether friends or enemies, have my greatest respect and that of all of us. May their death be an eternal memory for us and our children.